Do you remember these words at the consecration at Mass? Do this in memory of me. Well, what exactly does Jesus expect us to do in memory of him? One way to look at it is that Jesus means that we perpetuate this sacrifice of the Mass. We continue celebrating this sacrament. But a look at the Jewish roots of this invite us to a deeper understanding of what Jesus expects of us, what he expected of his disciples. St. Paul, in today's second reading, speaking of the Eucharist, tells us that when Jesus took the cup, he gave it to his disciples to drink, and he said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." And there we have it. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Blood, my dear brothers and sisters, for the Jews meant life. And therefore, it was a way of Jesus saying, this cup represents my life given for you. But then he adds another phrase. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. So it's not just him giving his life for us, but rather him making a new covenant with us. Covenants, my dear brothers and sisters, were new relationships that were formed. And every covenant in the Old Testament and at Jesus' time was signed in blood, because covenants were considered as life-giving. They formed new relationships. And so, my dear brothers and sisters, I'd like to dramatize this a bit. Imagine Jesus at the Last Supper, and imagine him giving the cup to his disciples and saying these words, "Do this in memory of me. This cup is the new covenant in my blood." What would Jesus be expecting the disciples to understand? And what would the disciples in turn understand as they sipped from that cup? Certainly, they would understand this simple fact, that Jesus was now sharing his mission with them. And Jesus would expect them to continue the same mission which he began. They in turn would understand that Jesus' mission is now their mission. And this is what is made clear as we look at the other readings of today. In the first reading, we have Melchizedek bringing bread and wine to offer Abraham and his fellow men to celebrate their victory over their enemies. Very often when you and I, as modern-day Christians, read these words, we immediately hook on to the words bread and wine. But let's pause and walk back into the time of Melchizedek and Abram. Well, the giving of bread and wine wouldn't recall images of the Eucharist for them then. But certainly it would prefigure what you and I know today as the Eucharist. The focus of the first reading is about the celebration that would have taken place. The meeting, the hospitality, the sharing of the bread, the sharing of the wine, in other words, the sharing of the meal. Speaking of the meal, the Gospel speaks of Jesus feeding the 5,000. We are called to focus not so much on the feeding, which is miraculous indeed, but rather to focus on the process of this feeding. Notice that Jesus tells the disciples, "Give them something to eat." And the disciples protest, "But we have only 5 loaves and 2 fish. And then notice what Jesus tells them to do. Make them sit down in groups of 50. And then he takes the bread, he takes the fish, and he does the Eucharistic action, and he shares this with them. The very important part that we forget is the part that the apostles and the disciples play. Imagine seating a crowd of 5,000 in groups of 50. How long does it take you and me to settle a simple classroom full of students. Now imagine seating a crowd of 5,000. That involved a lot of work on the part of the disciples that very often goes unnoticed. The Eucharist, my dear brothers and sisters, more than just being a sacrifice and more than just being a sacrament, is our involvement in what Jesus does for us. Each one of us is called not just to celebrate a sacrament, but to involve ourselves and to give of ourselves, like the disciples did. This, my dear brothers and sisters, is the calling of the feast of today, of Corpus Christi, because you and I make up the body of Christ. The scriptures tell us that Christ is the head and the church, you and me, are his body. And while we celebrate and adore the Blessed Sacrament, each one of us is called, as St. Augustine says, when you come to receive the Lord, behold who you are and become what you receive. Ours is a quest of constantly improving and becoming the body of Christ.